For a game that's been alive and kicking for over 7 years, I'm honestly surprised with how consistent it's been in quality. And not necessarily when it comes to its power creep or how they changed the scope of the game in general, but more on its stability, which is something that I don't really say a lot often nowadays, which I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but you know, FEH has been relatively consistent for the most part. FEH does have its issues here and there, of course, because not every game is going to be perfect and some things are always just going to fall through the cracks. Sometimes that could be anything from skills and effects not working as intended to game crashing effects with stuff such as a Cher's attack animation, and as recent as Panette with a reopening and her PRF, except that one was kind of funny, and by funny I mean, well, I guess it depends on what you find funny, but that was in and out relatively quick, which I was surprised about. This exploit was pretty much under the radar for several years, and let me tell you, this one's a bit of a doozy. It wasn't necessarily a glitch in the same vein as Panette with reopening or Cher with her own attack animation, but it did exploit the game in its own right, and the reason as to why it lasted as long as it did was because any and all related information was kept behind closed doors. An exploit that would circumvent one of the most played game modes and was never addressed until suddenly brought to light one day. This is the FEH exploit that lasted several years, and that didn't roll off as well as I thought it was going to, but I'm gonna keep it in the video anyway. And I would like to preface, a fair bit of people did know about this exploit, but it was never spread around to the point where it became common knowledge. It was as much of a conspiracy as it could possibly made out to be, given how secretive it was, but what exactly was it, and how did it work? To answer this and potentially more, we have to go to the most played game mode in Fire Emblem Heroes, the same mode that has been around for effectively the entire lifespan of FEH, the Arena. Many of you may know what the Arena is given who this video is targeting, but for those who aren't aware and may be looking at this from the outside in, here's a brief rundown. The Arena has each player attempt to win 5 consecutive matches without losing any of their allies and snagging bonus kills with their respective bonus unit to build up a cumulative score. You need 4 relatively newish units that can reach a certain score bin that's based on their starting base stat total, although newish may not necessarily apply depending on the archetype, but generally it's based on their base stat totals, and if they can meet a certain criteria, then they're going to be able to score well in the mode. You also have legendaries that can further extend the amount of score that you get, and each legendary has their own season, but generally you'll have to run roughly 1 to 2 legendaries, although the latter is much more optimal if you're looking for a higher score. You give each character their own respective blessing that aligns with the legendary, and then you'll end up getting even more score in the process. And modern legendaries in Modern Arena also makes it so that if you are able to bring them as a bonus, then it can make the process of going for specific scores much easier because it shuffles a random score between certain bins depending on what types of characters you decide to bring. Also, beyond the amount of stats that each character ends up having, you also have to factor in the amount of skills they have and how much they score individually. And after tallying up the skill costs total, then you have another factor that helps you with scoring in general. And lastly, you need to just have a good amount of merges on each character, which is a system that allows you to boost up characters even more, up to 10 times, so that you can further add to the amount of score that you'll get each match. And after you do all 5 matches without losing anybody or surrendering, you'll end up getting your final score. And that is probably a lot, even for the people who just know how Arena works. And for what it's worth, you don't necessarily need to know all the ins and outs when it comes to the system, but basically the idea is to outscore as many people as possible using all the factors that come into Arena itself, which would be legendary units, skills, merges, and depending on the unit, just how much they score in general. And the higher you score, the higher rewards you get because you'll be in the higher tiers. And that is generally easier said than done because depending on who you build up, it doesn't really matter if they're good or bad in pretty much every single mode. The main point is just going to be whether or not they have a good base stat total or anything that allows them to score relatively well beyond that. So depending on the type of team and units that you end up using, you could easily get knocked out of the higher tiers if your opponents have the latest and greatest when it comes to units or fodder. And naturally with that type of system, it's definitely going to be a lot more resource heavy, and depending on how much time and resources you're willing to dedicate to that mode, you could easily put into all sorts of other game modes that may reward you based on skill rather than how much you're willing to pull and spend on the mode itself, because generally the return investment that you get out of the Arena isn't particularly great outside of you maybe get some feathers and codes and maybe depending on some other things, but generally when it comes to orb cost analysis, it's never really the best. But that's how you're going to score as well as you possibly can. Otherwise, you're just kind of out of luck, and you can kind of balance between some of the lower tiers features, but still make a decent amount of rewards. A lot of people tend to do that anyway, myself included, because again, generally the amount of resources that would have to go into it may not necessarily mean much at the end of the day, and usually the gap between rewards isn't that drastic. It usually varies by maybe a single orb or some dragon flowers or other miscellaneous resources that could go into the game itself, with the exception of the arena crown, which doesn't really do anything beyond aesthetics. However, if there was a way to circumvent that system and have the ability to score high enough for the best rewards with as bare minimum resources as possible, would you take that opportunity? Because I can tell you a lot of people did. Enter the arena scoring exploit that allowed you to do just that. If you didn't want to bother with spending hundreds or even thousands of orbs to earn a fraction of that back in a crown on the front of your user, then this is, or I guess was because it's patched, the solution. Although it's debatable as to whether it's easier or more difficult to get off the ground, because yeah, there's some decent factors going into that. Essentially, take all the arena basics that I barfed onto you and you probably didn't digest that well and throw it out the window, because the last thing anybody was doing with this exploit was aiming for optimization. Although maybe some optimization in some other way, but you'll see what I mean. In order to properly exploit the scoring system so that a player could score well without all the inheritance and merges or any of the amount of resources that would require you to get to the point where you're getting the highest tier rewards, they would have had to run a core of units that resembled something close enough to a team that could potentially score without having the ability to. And the process for that was kind of weird. Usually you have 4 units that you would bring to the arena, and all of them would probably have like a lot of merges, high tier skills, some of them would even be legendaries. But not with this, although you would need at least one high scoring unit. That would be the first unit that would go into the first slot of your team. A high scoring unit or lead, so that it could at least present itself as a plausible scoring option. Next, you would need to have an actual legendary unit that was in season. You didn't necessarily need 2, but you would have 1 just so that it could at least present itself as the ability to score. But I didn't exactly understand why it worked the way it did. It's just that you had to do it in this specific way. Also, they didn't really need to be optimized. Really, it just had to be unoptimized, and they had to be a legendary that was in the season so that it could at least present itself again as a scoreable unit. The third slot following the legendary was somebody that scored even less than the legendary unit, and it didn't necessarily have to be another legendary, just something that didn't score all too well. And then the last slot, and you'll never believe it, scores even less than the previous 3 slots. So you have the highest scoring unit in the first slot, which would be your lead, the unoptimized legendary that would still score pretty well, but not as well as your first slot, and not to the point where you could actually fight an opponent with a similar score range, a poor scoring unit, and this could easily just be a level 1 4-star, and then somebody that somehow scored even worse than that, which usually happened to be a dancer because at least you got some utility out of it. But essentially, you just had to run this really weird core of, hey, this could potentially score, but it really doesn't. And for some inexplicable reason, it didn't know how to properly throw you into an opponent that you could really match into. So what would essentially happen is you would score so low that it would push you to the first opponent at the highest rank, meaning that you could have a really cheap core of units that could just fight a really strong opponent, and you could still get all the benefits of the score as long as you're able to win, effectively underflowing the score system where it would have to default you to something as close as possible, which would most likely be whoever's at the top. And for what it's worth, it does sound kind of difficult if you're trying to do a 1v4 against a really decked out opponent with really built out units and modern skills and pretty much all the junk that would make it really difficult to just fight them, even with a core of 4 really built units. But this is where it gets interesting, because a lot of people have historically ran high scoring units with extremely mediocre kits that not only allow them to maintain high scoring, but also make them painfully easy to take out. So even when fighting a 1v4, it became extremely manageable. And I would imagine this is how a lot of this was navigated. It definitely falls more into the conspiracy theory territory. However, I would like to imagine that there was a system that made this plausible, especially given how behind closed doors this whole thing was. I can't imagine they didn't have a system in check to make sure that they can even do it themselves. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a log or tally, or any sort of indicator with the username system that people use to properly find these opponents so they could actively score well without the headache of navigating through many of the opponents that would otherwise make it near impossible. But you know, that's more tinfoil hat metrics than anything substantial, so let's stick more to the facts. Although for what it's worth, I wouldn't be making this video discussing it if it were still hidden knowledge, and funnily the way it got out was fairly simple in the grand scheme. Somebody streamed it on Twitch. It was done on purpose, of course, and the goal was more or less to get it out into the open, but it's funny thinking about how simple of a catalyst it was, because once the stream concluded, knowledge of the exploit spread like wildfire. And I remember I was also covering it years ago when it was first breaking. I was in the talks with the dude who pretty much had all the knowledge on it, and I had videos in the past talking about it, but those videos are old, and I'd like to imagine that both the substance of the video and the mic quality were not that great, so what a better time to revisit the topic with a much grander perspective, or at least as grand as it can possibly get. But of course, once the word spread, that's when it was looked into by IS and subsequently patched out, but only after much more people also tried it out for themselves, which is where it got even funnier. The reason the arena matches underflowed to the top players was because no one could theoretically match into a player with that low of an arbitrarily low score, but because a significant amount of people started attempting it just to replicate the exploit, it became even more difficult to underflow because there were people within the same bracket attempting the exploit, meaning that you were basically running into every single exploiter. Although eventually it was patched out in version 5.4, which was back in April of 2021, I believe. And to my understanding, there hasn't been any other means of getting around the arena scoring system since, which would effectively put this whole thing to rest. But there's still the matter of when it first came about to begin with. It's hard to say exactly when the exploit was first discovered or when it was first introduced into FEH, since the amount of people in the know was much more limited at the time. And while it could have theoretically existed since its conception, I'm led to believe that may have not been there since launch, partly because the system we had by that point was much different from how arena scoring used to work. The arena had a slightly different way of calculating overall score back at launch, where scoring was based on the opponent's total stats in BST, whereas now it's something we're all more familiar with, or maybe depending if you didn't even digest whatever I said and barfed at you, still not really familiar with. This only came after a couple months after the launch of FEH, so there's a solid chance that the exploit didn't exist at launch. However, the exploit could have existed under several other circumstances, including the addition of legendaries back in version 2, the addition of tier 21 and bonus hero kills when that was implemented, the second wave of legendaries that boosted their own BST back in version 3.2, and the arena scoring system overhaul back in version 1.2. And to be quite frank, I think the most plausible conclusion would be with the scoring overhaul, since it changed its priorities on how a team could score in arena, but given that a lot of the notable results included legendaries, it might have been tied to that instead, especially when they started rolling out units with higher and higher BST. The addition of tier 21 and bonus kill requirements most likely didn't factor into the matchmaking, but it did contribute in its own right to ranking. I'm not keen on that point as much as the former, although if anything, it made it easier to reach higher ranks since the percentile needed to reach certain tiers started shifting by that point. The only other plausible point would come with the new age of legendary units that scored a fixed amount of BST in arena regardless of their natural BST count. They were also the first legendary units to incorporate the pair-up system that, while didn't affect arena directly, were still a feature that played into other Coliseum modes that, you know, maybe could have had an impact on arena in some case, but I'm also not as keen on that since it didn't require any pair-up, but you still had the fixed BST regardless, and maybe that fixed legendary status made it all the easier, but I don't believe that was the tipping point over the addition of the first round of legendary units, and we may never know exactly when it started, but I am willing to say around version 2, when legendaries started also incorporating into scores, that's when it probably was the most likely case. But regardless of when it started, it had only been around for a long time and inadvertently came at the cost of many players attempting to play fair and square from those who were privy on the exploits. And while the argument could potentially be made for it not really doing anything substantial at the end of the day, I think it's important to remember that this did affect players that were actively dumping resources into the mode itself. Since the scoring was based on the percent amount of players fighting for the higher ranks, people who had spent plenty of money and time on the game to get to those higher ranks could have easily been kicked out because of players underflowing to a much higher score. And by effectively cheating them out of what could have been a higher tier placement or maintaining their rank, they basically wasted many of their resources because of being kicked out unfairly. So I think it's definitely better that it no longer exists, although if the message was also sent to players that you could just exploit your way to the top and you didn't need to spend any resources doing it, then I can't imagine a lot of people would bother with Arena after that point. And, you know, for what it's worth, while the exploit definitely made it easier to get through Arena, I think with all the quality of life features, including being able to lose a unit if you have the respective bonus legendary unit, or with the release of newer units that can score a fixed high amount of BST regardless of their natural amount of stats, making it easier to score even higher, I think there's a lot of other ways that you could get through Arena, even if it's still a bit more difficult. Although with Celica and the Celica ring, it's probably worse than it's ever been, but at least we have many tools and effects to make it less pain-inducing, including a one-off B-slot that scores much higher than every other inheritable passive for some reason, thus making scoring even harder. Also, I can't really imagine how many people would be able to deal with all the modern stuff if it were still a 1v4 territory, so if it wasn't patched out through IS, and it may have been patched through sheer power creep.